This is going to be a really fascinating session, I think. We've got some very distinguished inclusions on the panel. I'll call them up one by one, as is our practice. Actually, I wanted to make a quick note before I forget. This is a totally unrelated point, but if I don't say it now, I'll forget. And that is, I know that I can't be the only one who's been scribbling notes during these sessions, and where presenters have had slides, I've been trying to write down all the details. The slides will be distributed to you. So if you have been feeling anxious about that, please take it off your list of anxieties. As I said, irrelevant right now, but now it's been said and you won't forget. So our first panellist is Helen Gibbons, Executive Director of Early Education for the United Workers' Union, very large national union across many industries in our economy. Helen herself spent 20 years working as an educator, primarily with 2- and 3-year-olds, before becoming a union official and leading the national work in early education. Welcome, Helen. And we also have Carolyn Morris, who is the CEO YMCA Victoria. She started at YMCA Victoria in 2018 and strategically now oversees the organisation's 150 locations across camps, recreation, pools, early education and childcare, youth services and community programs. Welcome, Carolyn. And we also have Gabrielle Sinclair, who's the CEO of the Australian Children's Education and Care Quality Authority, ACIQA. I'm sure she'll correct me. ACIQA, I'm sorry, it's been a long day, which is the Independent National Authority for the Early Childhood Education and Care Sector's National Quality Framework. At least I haven't mistaken you for a dead Scottish novelist, Gabrielle, so please, it's not even the worst error I've made all day. Gabrielle started out as a teacher and has held senior executive positions in a number of Queensland government portfolios, including education, infrastructure and planning, local government and corrective services. And before her appointment to ACIQA, Gabrielle was Deputy Director General, Early Childhood and Community Engagement in the Queensland Department of Education and Training. And breathe. Well, this is a very easy field to work in, where conditions are fine and nobody has differing views on anything, right? That's the thing. Can I just start with a dumb question as a parent? When are we going to make our children's hours the same as our work hours? I mean, blue sky, right? But what is it with this, scrabble around at 3 o'clock and sneak away and, to me, that seems like a really big part of integration. I've totally surprised the whole panel with this massively self-centred question, and I promise there'll be more sensible questions afterwards. But I mean, it's an example of these sort of structural patterns of thought that we have that we think are not changeable because that's how it's always worked. But actually, the Australian population is massively different now from the way it was when those things were decided. And for instance, lots of mums are working.
I think, do you just talk and it works?
You talk in it and it will come.
There was a button I needed to press. I think it's a really, harking back to the speech that Jade just delivered, it's a really good example of the systemic mess that is early education. If you're in long daycare, you might get care until 6 o'clock. If your child, though, goes to kindy, which might be called something different depending on what state you're in, that probably finishes at 3. There might be some sort of wraparound care. You might start work really early. You've got to be lucky if you can get into a service. And what's happened is there's this kind of hodgepodge of arrangements, and none of that has really put the child at the centre of that decision making, or for that matter, the parent at the centre of that decision making. It's really been about cobbling something together and some very unintegrated policies.
And there's a lot of anxiety associated with that, isn't it? I remember when my first kid was a toddler, the things that you didn't know that you really had to know, like which centre you need to put your name down at when you've just got a twinkle in your eye, I mean, you haven't even had the kid yet, or what the supply or undersupply is like in your area. I remember the incredible palaver that went into opening a childcare centre in this building, which involved multiple inquiries, which ultimately came up with the conclusion that if they were to change one of the squash courts or non-members bars or whatever into a childcare centre, it would be unworkable because it would cost up to $80 a day. And who would pay that? Whereupon everybody from Sydney just went, I will commute from Sydney for childcare. Yep. And so anyway, I wonder, we've been talking a little bit about our capacity to rethink old structures. Do you think in this sector there is a good starting point for that?
So I believe in the neuroscience that says if you want someone to listen, you say 3 positive things first, or maybe 5, and then you say the sort of really thing that you want to say. So I'm going to start with the positives, and that is that Australia is internationally recognised for really high quality early childhood education and care. I cannot tell you how many countries have come to us, including the ones that you would never dream of, including Norway, Canada, etc., etc.
No.
And they've said, how have you done such high quality? And I'm going to be really cheeky and say, there are so many different types of early childhood education. We've got extremely high quality long day care. We've got extremely high quality family day care. We've got outside school hours care. We've got kindies, preschools. I really want to start by saying, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, because we've got dedicated people, a really highly qualified workforce, and we've got lots of choices for parents.
And throwing babies out with bathwater is also just not best practice across this
Not
industry.
great practice.
I just hasten to, yes.
And we're not a care sector. I want to be really bold and say we're an education sector. And so one of the things that we were talking about at our table, you know, the really interesting connections that we've made today about how do you get more men into, you know, the sector that we're working in. Well, the first thing is stop calling it childcare. You know, we are not childcare. We are about education. We're about children's early learning. We're about keeping children in outside school hours care and vacation care safe. We're teaching them social skills, as Jay said, executive functioning in a way that in our modern society where most children, for example, spend more time in outside school hours care than they do at school. You know, we have to stop thinking about it as babysitting, and I really challenge anyone to sort of say, let's water down the qualifications, you know, because Jay is quite right. The iron triangle, and you know, I've been in education for 4 decades, the iron triangle has never changed, and that is high qualifications, the ratios, and group size, because that enables really well-prepared, confident educators and teachers to build the relationships that Jay was talking about. So I will just say, if you're a parent or you're thinking about being a parent, it's a great place to put children in early education in Australia.
Thank you. Jay, you're a man. You've spent a lot of time really immersing yourself in this area, and as the only anatomically qualified person on the panel to talk about men and childcare, or what we have called childcare, what is off-putting about that term, do you think?
Well, I suppose to the extent that caring occupations have typically been female-dominated. But I do note that when the professionalisation of nursing started to lead to higher wages, you did see an influx of men into that profession. So I think the wages will help you get some of the way. I'm sure there are also some cultural issues, but I think there are some deeper things about social norms, about what are the roles in society, who does what. You know, I'm sure you've written a book about this, about the unfair distribution of responsibilities, and so part of our big reform push is paid parental leave, 12 months of paid parental leave, because those patterns are laid down very early, and they shift perspectives about whose job is to do what things. So I think it's a deep thing about caring roles and who's meant to do them.
I'm going to look for your questions in a second, but one thing that I've found has been one of the most absorbing and interesting trends across all the sessions we've had so far today is the idea of quantifying skills. I mean, Annie spoke to it very well, and addressing the skills that the individual has, not what our idea is in our brain about what the person looks like who does that job, right? And when you talk about the professionalisation of nursing, you're talking about that iteration of skills, the assessment of skills, and that being the tool by which you remunerate people, by which you recognise their suitability for a role, and in so doing, you also focus on people's abilities rather than the idea that they're just minding your kid for a bunch of hours, right? Carolyn, you look like you have thoughts.
Where my thoughts were with that is it's not just skills, it's also what a young person or that's entering in the workforce likes to do. And I often talk to young people that want to become swim instructors or out of school hours care coordinators or educators. Do they actually like children? Because if they don't, please don't go into the industry because you are going to have to work with children. So perhaps that's something that whether you're a female or a male, you need to consider before you enter. But then obviously there is the skills and there's skill transfer. So if I talk about swim instructors, often they will move into being teachers, they'll move into being early learning, and the last panel, it's not something we consciously do, so in recreation, but it is something that just happens. And I think that's really important as well.
So if it already just happens, what's the best way to take that pattern that's occurring and derive more benefit from it?
I think that's probably where the last panel was saying we've been so concerned with just restarting our sectors, whether it's childcare, whether it's recreation, whether it's camping, we've been desperate. Like we literally woke up out of COVID with 30% of our staff. So we're like a startup. And so what we had to do is just focus on that. However, what naturally is happening is the young people that come, and I'm looking at Nadine, the young people that come into our careers, they see themselves at a very early age, they see themselves moving to coordinators if they're in out of school hours care, or leaders in rooms, after being educators, or area managers, like, people out in the crowd. And I think that's where we've got to nurture, that leadership skills as well.
And the sense of a career path.
Yes, and I think if we can test that with men more, because that's where you're going to get younger men coming into these careers to see that career progression.
How interesting. So I wonder if you could share with us your direct experience of what you felt you were able to change once you'd accidentally lost such a big chunk of your workforce through no fault of your own. They didn't leave because they hate the work. They left because there was a giant pandemic issue that made things very tricky. So did you feel at the time that you were able to make changes in the way you structure or regulate your workforce, or was it just such a survival situation that you couldn't really?
Yeah. I think the speed of change happened exponentially. So firstly we had JobKeeper, so we had to change and do all of that. We actually closed before JobKeeper happened. So we literally took 1,000 of our employees and talked to retailers like Coles and Woolworths, and we gave them jobs immediately. So change happened exponentially. But I think what you're talking about is systematic change. So we've changed all of our systems, we've changed all of our practices. We've really taken the opportunity to say, if something like this is going to happen to us, how do we change everything we do? That's still, I'm going to say, quite looking at our navels because we've changed ourselves. Now I think it's time, we're only just looking up. I'm in Victoria, so we were the hardest hit. We're now just looking up and going, how can we change the industry? How can we do things differently?
Well, it's kind of an exciting set of propositions once you get over the raw existential terror. Do you have something to add?
I was going to add something when we were talking about skills, but I
Do it.
also wanted to talk about COVID. But Thinking about skills, I think there's often this idea when people talk, I focus on long day care, so the sector, people who work in long day care, and there's often this idea that if you build the skill set, that's the pathway to better remuneration. But everybody who works in long day care is qualified. They have skills, and their experience is that that is not the pathway to better pay. And in fact, there is very little incentive for anybody to upskill, and we have real challenges trying to get people to upskill because the wage increase is very minor between each of the levels. And so there's been this idea in the past about build it and they'll come, and they don't come because they're not stupid. They look at the pay rate and think, why should I do that qualification? Because it's not going to actually achieve anything for me. But also reflecting on the pandemic and the different experiences across the pandemic. In early education, in long day care, we lost JobKeeper and all of the casuals were disconnected from the workforce and they never came back. Long day care stayed open. They were relied on by the community and by the government all across the country and yet rarely mentioned, rarely talked about by politicians. They lost JobKeeper, they lost their security of employment, and the solution to that, or the policy solution, was the government gave the employers money and trusted them to pass that on to the early educators, and many educators will tell you how badly that turned out. And so all of this kind of built on educators went into the pandemic knowing that they were undervalued, and they came out of the pandemic having confirmed all of that and also incredibly stressed and burnt out. And that's why we've lost so many.
Okay, so we've arrived at the point, and can I just get an idea of, okay, great. You, Jenny, address the question that's come in, and then I'll have another one if there's a lapse.
So one from the people at home for probably each panellist. If you could make one policy change overnight, what would it be?
Oh, I love those. Everybody always squirms. Jay?
Oh, it'd have to be the wages. If you don't have a workforce, you can't build the system. It's the first cab off the rank.
In outer school hours care, I'd harmonise the environment, whether it's ratios, qualifications. For a national provider, it's next to impossible.
Every survey that we ask of educators says that the number one issue is wages, and that without fixing wages in the sector, you can't fix anything. So I would fix the wages.
And I'm lucky enough to come last, so I'd say all of those, plus the comment earlier today about you can't fill up a bucket that's got holes in the bottom, and everything is interrelated. And if you increase the wages, you also have to invest in their induction, their onboarding, their ongoing professional development and their professional identity.
Why do people leave your bit of the sector?
They are incredibly burnt out after COVID. They feel undervalued and underappreciated, but the number one reason is their really low pay. And when you're feeling really burnt out and really stressed, and then you look at your pay packet and can't raise your own children, then of course they're leaving. And the more people that leave, the more the people left behind are experiencing increasingly workload pressures because they're working alongside casuals and agency staff. So it's just this escalation.
So you've already talked about the, sorry, I'll let you jump in a sec. I just wanted to drill. You make it.
The only other point I would add to that, because I agree with all of that, is also other sectors like NDIS and home care packages. You can earn double the amount and have more flexibility.
This was going to be my question. So you've already, no, it's brilliant. It's so economical. Because you were talking about the unintended consequences of people aren't stupid. They think, well, is it worth me investing my time and resources into these further qualifications when it doesn't really make much difference to what's in my pocket? And of course, if you then see an allied sector which is paying much better for skills that are related to the ones you have, then it's kind of not ridiculous, right, to jump. So,
But there's more.
Yes.
And that early childhood teachers, I know that in the eastern states, and we're seeing it more and more, there's a shortage of school teachers. And so what we've found in the studies and longitudinal studies that are being done over the last 10 years, early childhood teachers, once they get their qualifications, their they go into schools. Better pay, better working conditions, pupil-free days, longer holidays. And so it's not one problem.
And to add to that, there's also actually a higher need or demand because of free kindergarten as well. So there's thousands and thousands of jobs that are more jobs on top of an industry that is already experiencing undersupply.
Okay, so you've got in front of you in this room a group of people who make decisions in other sectors whose decisions do have an impact on your capacity to retain workers. What would you like to say? This is the listening. They'll talk back tomorrow.
Can I just challenge that a bit?
Yeah.
Because, the studies that we have been looking at, early childhood educators, if they're a teacher, they go to schools, it's a no-brainer. If they're an educator, it depends on the community in which they live. And so we've had educators leave to become drivers in the local mines. It's not a pathway that goes from early childhood to aged care. That's not true. That's a myth. And I think we have to be careful about saying, what is it about, the things that James / John was talking about today was the fact that, we need communities that have stable employment conditions that will give them enough money to pay their mortgage and to live like human beings. And so our educators don't jump from one care sector to another. That's
absolutely our experience too. I mean, some do. I mean, the recent aged care wage case, I think, has attracted some educators into aged care where they can earn significantly more. But actually, most of the educators that we talk to that leave are going on to do things like retail because they can earn more and they don't have to take homework home with them to deal with. So I don't think it's necessarily that they're going on to other places in the care sector.
Okay, noted. We've got a question over here.
Hi, I'm Julie Price from Community Childcare.
Just nice and close to your mouth.
Thank you. I was just wondering if Helen would talk to people from outside our sector about what we are doing about the wages, because I think it's a really important piece of work that is happening that's hopefully going to have an impact soon.
Thanks, Julie. And I think, I often do these doom and gloom, like it's really bad. Educators are leaving the sector, they all need a pay rise. But it's important to point out that there is a pathway that we've been working on with the government's new laws that allow for multi-employer bargaining, that allow you to ask the Fair Work Commission to make the government participate in those negotiations because they're the funder. And we're the first cab off the rank, we're the test case, and we've started that process. And what's really important about that is not just the opportunity to get better wages, but it's also, it's quick. You can do it really quickly. It's not like a wage case that will take years, or an equal pay case that will take 5 years and then they'll throw it out. It's quick. It allows you to eyeball the government, but thirdly, it's also really empowering for educators, because educators are sitting at the table talking about their wages and conditions and talking to government about it. They're the ones that negotiate it, they're the ones that enforce it, and I think that that's really important. They're not a bystander in this problem, they are the solution to this problem.
Can I add to
Yes,
that?
please.
As an employer, particularly we've got early learning centres and we've got out of school hours care centres, I think that there wouldn't be one employer if the government is going to pay higher levels of childcare subsidy, that I think that will be completely passed on. I think where we're nervous at the moment is that the wage activity is all in early learning and it's not in out-of-school hours care. And we're very nervous that the same settings won't be in both, and then we'll lose educators in out-of-school hours care. And to give you some statistics, out-of-school hours care is only 9% of the federal childcare subsidy, and yet nearly 40% of families use it. And it's so important for families to experience 0 to 5 and have both parents being able to work and being productive. And then they can't just all of a sudden, to your early point, not have out-of-school hours care from 6 to 12, because you don't want children, those children can't just walk at home. The system hasn't changed, and so that's the gap that out-of-school hours care creates. So that's just the level of nervousness that we have.
And this is going to get a lot worse when I'm Prime Minister and I make schools go till 5 p.m. It's going to be very disruptive. We have another... Oh, no, hang on. Jay, do you want to say something? And then we've got another... We have another question from this hyper-engaged table here, and then we'll go up the back. So, go.
Miranda Edwards, National Workforce Director for SNAKE, which, if no one knows what SNAKE is, it's Secretariat National Aboriginal Voice for Children. I suppose the question is to the panel is, how do you see improving the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander workforce? They bring a set of skills that is not recognised. They also are burnt out, like the sector is, but during the pandemic, you know, the pressure of the health aspect of that we were told if, you know, we had to stay open because of our vulnerable children situation, as well as the health aspect that if Aboriginal people got COVID, we would die straight away. So we, you know, just the messaging that happened during that. So what I've found since then is a lot of our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander workforce, that 20 plus years of working, have left. So how can we retain that? How can we improve that? Because our children need our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander workforce within their centres.
Can I have a go answering that? Because I think that the Aboriginal community case points up, because it's the extreme example, it points up what's missing in the system more generally. So if it's true, I agree with the point that was made about we've got a high quality system, but we don't have a very accessible system. It doesn't actually go to all places. There's so-called childcare deserts, and remote Aboriginal communities, or really any Aboriginal communities, are underserved in terms of early education and care. So you need a specific policy response to ensure that something happens in those places. But you also need a counterpart workforce development policy in those areas because of the special circumstances. Not only does it have to be culturally safe, it has to recognise that the workforce shortage issue is so much more extreme in those areas, and it might require us to think, you know, in quite different ways about from whom we recruit and how training occurs, you know, and it goes to that point I was trying to make right at the start. If you actually had a systemic view that saw it's as important to fund the services as funding the services as important to think about workforce development, you'd fund that as well. That would be a separate part of the funding. You can't get away with saying, here's a subsidy, problem solved. It's the subsidy, and now what is the operational capacity to deliver this thing? There's a workforce question there that needs to be looked at, and then be a subset of that as Aboriginal communities, kids with disabilities, out-of-home hours, kids that are coming in from the child protection system, remote and regional kids, be all sorts of differentiated responses, but somebody's got to be funded to think about those things and design the policy solutions.
It's kind of a reflection of what Jim was saying earlier about the right resources being in the right place at the right time, right, which is always the hardest thing to coordinate. We'll take this question from up the back before we run out of time, which is like really almost now.
Hi, Rebecca Matthews from TAFE New South Wales. Rightly so that early education and care is an important part of our workforce, and the challenges you've all mentioned are certainly out there. I'm a recipient of out-of-school care, couldn't survive without it, so thank you for all those workers out there. But I really wanted to talk about school-based education support, which is a growing sector that sort of falls into this area as well, where we have a synergy between them, and we're having a real struggle in finding people to be able to be trainers in this area, because it's the highest demand with the increase with NDIS for the diagnosis within the school system. Do you have any thoughts on this?
That's a really great question. Does anyone want to jump into it? Not vocation care. People who come into schools to assist with students with special needs, or I think that's what we're talking about, right? Yep. I mean, I know from my kids' public primary school is that sometimes you get in a staff-strapped environment, an extra pair of hands becomes sort of an extra pair of hands that is sort of, I mean...
I probably don't know in a school environment because we don't work in the school environment, but certainly in the early learning environment, what we find is there's obviously a lot of neurodiverse children and educators that are ill-equipped and in out-of-school hours care as well. And the funding to, or the way that you get funding at the moment for additional care is really difficult. So our issue is not actually attracting the right level of people into it, but it's actually making sure that we get the funding for it. And sometimes what happens, particularly in out-of-school hours care, is you will get the funding and then that child doesn't turn up and that day you don't get the funding. So it makes it really hard, particularly we're a not-for-profit provider, so we still do it, but for the for-profit providers, it's really difficult and should be probably based on the child's booking, not their attendance.
That's interesting. Yeah.
The only two things I know about this is that I know that Victoria recently at their last election made a big commitment around rolling out, I don't know what they called them, whether it was school nurses or wellbeing officers or mental health. There was certainly some wraparound support that they proposed to roll out in their school-based education system. Now, I'm told it was wildly popular. It emerged from essentially community demand from parents to do such a thing. The only other thing I know that's under discussion is a bit of a standoff between the states and the Commonwealth around where NDIS begins and ends. And I think that there's a bit of a dilemma about whether that school-based supports are the province of state governments and NDIS is...
Of course, shifting between two
Yes.
levels of government.
So I think there are...
We've not seen before.
They're the two contemporary things I'm aware of. I'm sorry, I don't know much more about...
Federation reform is the answer, people, but afternoon tea is upon us. I'm going to teach that Federation a big lesson when I'm Prime Minister. We are going to break for afternoon tea because it's been a massive afternoon and we have one more session to come.